He ruled an empire of millions. He owned more gold than any king in Europe. His capital was larger, cleaner, and richer than London, Paris, or Madrid. And in less than 2 years he handed all of it to 600 strangers who arrived by sea. This is not the story of a battle lost. It is the story of a man who surrendered a world without ever drawing his sword. In the year 1502, Montezuma the Second became the ruler of the Aztec Empire. He was not a soft man. He had been a war priest, a commander, a conqueror. Under him, the empire stretched from coast to coast, swallowing city after city, demanding tribute in gold, in feathers, in grain, and in human lives. Tenochtitlan, his capital, floated on a lake like something out of a dream. Causeways crossed the water. Canals ran between the houses. Temples rose higher than anything the Spanish would later admit they had ever seen. 200,000 people lived there. It was, by almost every measure, the greatest city in the world. Montezuma sat at the center of it like a living god. Men were not allowed to look him in the eye. The ground he walked on was swept before his feet. He changed his clothes 4 times a day, and never wore the same garment twice. He had everything a ruler could want. And that, in the end, was exactly the problem. A man who has everything has the most to lose. In the spring of 1519, messengers came running to his palace with news that did not make sense. Towers were floating on the eastern sea. Mountains were moving on the water. And from them had stepped pale men with beards, men who rode great deer with no horns, men whose weapons spat fire and thunder. Montezuma listened, and something in him went cold, because he, like his priests, carried an old fear in his heart, a prophecy, a god who had sailed away to the east long ago, and who had promised one day to return. The pale men were not gods. They were soldiers. Their leader was named Hernan Cortes, and he had come not to worship Montezuma, but to take everything he owned. Cortes had perhaps 600 men, 16 horses, and a handful of cannon. Against an empire of millions, it was nothing. It should have been nothing. But Cortes understood something Montezuma did not. He understood that an empire is not its emperor. It is the fear and the hatred of everyone the emperor has crushed. As the Spanish marched inland, they found allies everywhere. The Tlaxcalans who had fought the Aztecs for generations. The cities bled dry by tribute. The peoples who had watched their sons and daughters dragged to the altars of Tenochtitlan. One by one they joined Cortes, not because they loved the strangers, but because they hated Montezuma more. The 600 became thousands. The thousands became an army. And still Montezuma did not march out to destroy them while he could. This was his first and greatest mistake. He had the power in those early weeks to crush the Spanish utterly. He could have closed the mountain passes. He could have sent 10,000 warriors for every one of theirs. Instead, he sent gifts. Gold. Jewels. Treasures meant to satisfy the strangers and send them home. But gold does not make hungry men leave. Adieu. It teaches them to stay. Every gift Montezuma sent only proved how much there was to take. In November of 1519, Cortes and his men walked into Tenochtitlan, unopposed. Montezuma came out to meet them on the great causeway, carried on a litter of gold and feathers, and he welcomed the men who had come to destroy him into the heart of his city. He gave them a palace to stay in. He fed them. He showed them his treasures. The most powerful man in the Americas opened his front door and invited the storm inside. What happened next is almost too strange to believe. Within days, the Spanish seized Montezuma in his own palace, in his own capital, surrounded by his own people, and made him a prisoner. They did it with a few dozen men. And Montezuma, the living god before whom no man could raise his eyes, allowed it. He gave orders through Spanish guards. He told his people to stay calm, to obey, to bring more gold. He ruled an empire from inside a cage, and every day the bars grew tighter. We will never fully understand why he did not resist. Perhaps he still believed the prophecy. Perhaps he hoped to outwait them, to find the moment to strike. Perhaps a man raised to believe he was chosen by the gods simply could not imagine that the gods had abandoned him. But while Montezuma waited and calculated and obeyed, His people watched their god kneel before strangers, and something inside them broke. In the summer of 1520, the city finally rose. Not against the Spanish first, but against the emperor who had let them in. The Aztecs chose new leaders, war leaders, men who would fight. The streets filled with warriors. The Spanish, trapped in the heart of a hostile city, dragged Montezuma up onto a rooftop and ordered him to calm the crowd one last time. He stepped forward, the emperor of millions, and called for peace. And his own people answered him with stones. The accounts differ on how exactly he died. Some say the stones struck him down. Some say the Spanish killed him when he was no longer useful. Either way, the meaning is the same. The man who had ruled the greatest city in the world died despised by the very people who had once worshipped him. A prisoner in his own palace, killed in the ruins of the empire he had given away. Days later, the Spanish fled the city in the dark, weighed down with stolen gold, cut to pieces on the causeways as they ran. It is remembered as the Night of Sorrows. But it was not the end. Cortes returned with more allies, more men, and more cannon. He laid siege to Tenochtitlan, cut its water, starved it, and burned it street by street until the greatest city in the Americas was rubble in a bloody lake. The empire of millions was gone. In its place rose a Spanish town built on the bones of the old one. Montezuma had everything. The largest empire in his world, gold beyond counting, an army that outnumbered his enemies 100 to 1, and the absolute power to end the threat in a single afternoon. He lost it all not on a battlefield but in his own mind. He met a small band of strangers with fear instead of force, with gifts instead of armies, with hesitation instead of will. By the time he understood what they truly were, his people had already stopped believing in him. History remembers Cortes as the conqueror. But Tenochtitlan was not truly taken by 600 men and 16 horses. It was given away by one man who could not bring himself to act while there was still time to win. He had the power to crush them on the day they landed. He chose to wait, and waiting cost him an empire, his people, and his name. He was a god to millions. He died beneath their stones. The losing side